and they will.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. I totally understand. Okay, thank you, Anna, for those very kind words and your enthusiasm. And thank you, everybody, for putting your time aside. Busy teachers that you are, I guess it's the end of the day, but it doesn't mean that you're not necessarily free from all your duties and responsibilities. Anyway, what I'd like to do just to start, I'm just checking that everything's working here, that the chat is working. Um, Seems to be. So, what I'd like you to do, well, this is the description of the talk, which I hope is going to be less a talk and more a conversation, but we'll see. There's a lot of you. We'll do our best. But my job is to explain the dogma methodology, also share some practical insights, focusing on the techniques you can immediately use in your next class. So I do want to make this as practical as possible. I'm also aware that you may well be quite familiar because of my previous visits and webinars with Dogma and Teaching Unplugged. I'm just wondering if anybody was at this event in Kiev in 2019. It was a
I
weekend.
was, yeah, many.
It was a fantastic weekend, wasn't it? It absolutely imprinted on my memory. Natalia, whoops, you were there. It was that wonderful old palace in the center of Kiev, and we spent many long hours talking about dogma and teaching unplugged. And it was my chance to get to know a lot of teachers from Ukraine. In fact, people came all the way uh, from Donetsk. I seem to remember. It was quite extraordinary, the turnout and the enthusiasm. So, for those of you who were there, uh, please forgive me that a lot of this material will be familiar to you. Um, those of you who weren't, well, this is a way of catching up. But you may well be familiar with a lot of the background to the dogma teaching unplugged from previous talks that you've attended. I'm also here in Barcelona, of course, during the time when there was a conference every year run by International House. Okay, so I want just give you a couple of minutes to think of the questions that you would expect or would hope to be answered in this session. And you feel free to put these into the chat, and I'll try to collect them up. The October Palace, yes, Maria. Um, uh, so I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. If you have a question that you hope will be answered, then put it into the chat and we'll save them there and if possible, try to deal with them if they're not dealt with during the course of the session. So I'll give you a couple of minutes. Okay, here come the questions. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm from New Zealand, Oksana, but I live in Spain. Let's dealt with that question. question. Right. Yeah, we have some great questions here. I hope I'll be able to address them, and I'll give you time at the end if we get through. Um, Hang on, just let me catch these ones. Okay. Okay. Very good questions. And I'm not surprised that the questions are so perceptive. Okay, well let's move on now. But there'll be opportunity during the session to place more questions into the chat, and we'll see if we can accommodate them. And if need be, we might have to schedule another session to answer all the questions. I'm going to approach this session in a way I've never done before when I've been talking about dogma. So again, this will be the new bit. And I'm sort of referencing here one of my books, and you may well have been at the Cambridge University Press session. I think I did a year earlier in Kiev, where we gave away hundreds of these books. So basically, it's a kind of overview of the different or some language teaching methods. And I'm going to make a distinction, and I hope it will become obvious why, between, although there's 30 methods in this book, and there's many more methods in bigger books, I'm going to argue that essentially there's only two methods, or two, if you like, macro methods in all the history of language teaching. And I'm going to call these, for convenience, proactive methods and reactive methods. So I'm going to group all these 30 methods into one of these mega macro categories. So proactive methods are methods that attempt to predict what learners need, present what they need, and have them reproduce what you think they need. Yeah? So the syllabus is pre-selected. The language items, whether it's grammar or vocabulary, pronunciation or text types or whatever, are selected in advance of the lesson. Reactive methods, on the other hand, don't have an agenda of that kind. The language that is taught is the language that emerges. The language that practices is the language that emerges in the lesson, that comes up out of the language that's generated between the teacher and the students and each other. So that's the basic distinction between proactive methods and reactive methods. So in the proactive methods, the language is modeled and reproduced by the learners. The language may be modeled by the teacher, or maybe in a book, it may be mediated by all sorts of means. But in a reactive method, the learner's output, whether it's spoken or written, is reformulated by the teacher. Whatever the learners come up with, it's the teacher's job is to kind of tidy it up, to extend it, to elaborate it, to make it more accurate, to make it more fluent, etc. So the language that emerges is reformulated by the teacher. And the third feature is that the focus of pre-active methods is typically on accuracy of form, on the learner's ability to reproduce the pre-selected item accurately. Whereas in reactive methods, the focus is more on the creation of meaning. Learners are encouraged to make their own meanings using whatever language means they have available. And then this is, as we say, tidied up by the teacher. So that's the distinction I'm going to make. And let's just have a look at some examples. I mean, first of all, let me just say that they're not mutually exclusive. They're not mutually exclusive. Having a proactive and a reactive approach is possible to combine. And this, in effect, is what experienced teachers do. This is from a quote from a recent study of expert teachers at primary and secondary level. And one of the things they found in the research, they researched, I don't know how many teachers through interviews, etc. They said one of the most frequently reported themes in the data set reveals that expert teachers are, despite their careful planning, despite pre-selecting what they're going to teach, they are able to display flexibility during the lesson, improvising and responding appropriately to the learning as it happens. So, in other words, it's not that the lesson is written in stone just because it's the language is pre-selected. The teachers, during the course of the lesson, expert teachers, will display flexibility. They'll adapt the lesson to the way that they sense the students are responding to it. And we do this as experienced teachers. And this is why, I'll come back to this point a bit later on, this is why, in a sense, Dogma or teaching unplugged is really something that experienced teachers do anyway. But I'll come back to that point. The writers here, Jason Anderson and G. Tana, call this adaptive expertise, or that's what it's called in the literature. Adaptive expertise is the ability, the expertise to adapt in the moment. Yeah, you can think of other professions where this is very important. I mean, for example, in nursing nurses do things every day which are kind of routine. They do them very well, they do them very efficiently, the more experience they have. You could call that kind of expertise routine expertise. Teachers have routine expertise, the kinds of things that we do almost without thinking. We do them efficiently, we do them very well. The way we set up pair work, the way we use the technology, if we're using technology, and the way we put students into breakout rooms, the way we monitor the breakout rooms, etc. All these kinds of things are very routine. But stuff happens in hospitals, and there are emergencies, and people have to think on their feet, literally. And this is what's called adaptive expertise. And this is the same with teachers. It's less critical, perhaps, with teachers. There are not lives at stake, but the ability to adapt to the here and now, to think on your feet, is clearly a useful skill because we can never fully predict what's going to happen in a lesson. So that's the point I want to make too, that although I'm making a distinction between proactive and reactive approaches, they can and they do to a large extent combine, and that's perhaps another story, how they do that and how we can accelerate the process. But in the meantime, let's just go back to this distinction and look at some of the examples over history. So proactive methods include things like grammar translation, the direct method, audiolingualism, and what has been called the weak form of communicative language teaching. So if you look at course books, here is a grammar translation book. So you can see that the language is provided in English, it's translated in the act, and it is then practiced through a succession of exercises. This is clearly from China and clearly over 50 years old, but you recognize the kind of thing. So we have the language, the target language being mediated by the learner's mother tongue, but the language is given to the students. The sun is red, the sun is bright, the sun is Chairman Mao. That's the language that's modeled in the book. The students practice, repeat it, practice, etc. Yeah, it's pre-selected. It is proactive. That's grammar translation. what replaced grammar translation largely the end of the 19th century was the direct method. So instead of using translation to mediate the lesson, the teacher used gestures, acting, images, etc., anything so as to avoid using translation. And so we get long sequences like this. A Berlitz course, for example, put the book into your pocket. What do you do? I put the book in my pocket. What are you doing? I'm putting the book into my pocket, etc. So everything is kind of acted out. But the language is pre-selected. The language is pre-selected. The learners have no agency in terms of saying what they want to say. They have to say things like, I put the book into my pocket. And then the direct method, of course, as we know, evolved in the 20th century into audiolingualism, and you get a typical iconic display of language in the form of a substitution table here. So you get sentences like, Jose usually studies television in the afternoon. Or she often reads lunch at, it doesn't work entirely. These are not, anyway, whatever. And so these are the kind of patterns that are displayed through these tables and then practiced through drills, through language pattern practice drills in audiolingualism. And if anybody's in the room as old as I am, they may well have worked in a language laboratory where students practice these drills ad nauseam. Here's a drill from a book of that period, 1978. Why did you shut the door? Is the prompt, and you have to say, I shut it because I wanted to. Why did you hurt your sister? I hurt her because I wanted to. Why did you hit? This is really bizarre, actually. If you look at how it continues, it gets worse. But anyway, this is the kind of thing. There's no control over the content in terms of what is acceptable or appropriate or relevant to the learners, but they're taught to say things. Why did you beat your wife? I beat her because I wanted to. Can you imagine? Those from 1978. Hopefully we've come a long way since then. And then, of course, there's a communicative approach replaced or evolved out of all these different approaches in the 1970s, 1980s. And now you get a typical, this is from a course book 2010. But when you look at it, it's the learners are given the language. Yeah. So they have a dialogue on the left. It's in a restaurant. They have to fill in the gaps. And then they get the dialogue. And then if you go over to the other side, work in pairs, practice the conversation until you remember it. I mean, it's kind of like memorization. Close your book, practice the conversation again. And then it opens out into some kind of role play. But this is typical weak communicative language teaching. It's what was represented by the PPP kind of lesson plan model. Present the dialogue, practice it in a controlled way, and then produce it in a less controlled way through some kind of role play, for example. But it's proactive. The learners have no say over what meanings they want to express. The meanings and the forms that they are that represent them are given. Reactive methods, on the other hand, include community language learning. I'll show you in a certain example. A person called John Wade, I'll tell you about him in a minute. Task-based language teaching, sometimes called strong communicative language teaching. A guy in Canada called Ken Lackman's CAT framework. I'll explain that in a minute. And then, of course, the point, dogma teaching unplugged. So what I'm trying to do here is situate dogma within these two broad categories. On the one hand, proactive methods, on the other hand, reactive methods. And some of these reactive methods go back quite a way. And in fact, I was heavily influenced by community language learning. Community language learning, if you remember, was one of these sometimes called niche methods that developed in the United States, particularly after the demise of audiolingualism. There was a vacuum created, and it was the same time as education generally had taken a humanistic turn. Yeah? away from a purely cognitive view of learning to a more whole person or holistic view of learning, which included emotions, experiences, where the learner's whole person was valued. And so we get a method like this. This is how Charles Curran, who was the guy who formulated this method, illustrated how it works. Small circles of students where they sit in a circle and they have, so the students is the white lozenges, if you like. They have a counselor, each one in this case. It's completely unrealistic, but they have a counselor who speaks their language and the target language, bilingual counselors. So if there's a German student, they'll have a counselor who's German speaking, but also knows English, if that's the target language, and so on and so on, French, Spanish, Italian. I mean, it would mean as many counselors in the room as students. Completely unrealistic. But the way it worked in reality was that you have one counselor, and that's, you can see there on the left, the person standing, and the students and this all share a mother tongue, which the counselor teacher knows. Yeah. And what the students do, if you remember, you would have read about this, they construct a conversation. There's no topic, there's no theme, there's no grammar that's pre-taught, there's no vocabulary that's pre-taught. The conversation emerges out of whatever the students want to talk about. But they do it in a kind of rather, let's say, pedestrian way, in the sense that they don't just have a conversation, they elect to say something. So one might want to say to another, what did you do at the weekend? But she's not quite sure if she's got it right. So she says to the teacher, how do you say what do you do at the weekend? Yeah. She asks in her first language, whether it's Ukrainian, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Spanish, whatever. Teacher whispers what to say. Student practices it and then commits it to a recording using a recording device, which of course now is much easier with one phone just going around. Yeah. And addresses another student who answers that question in the same way, saying to the teacher, how do you say I went to the beach, blah, 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 etc. Together, then they construct a conversation about whatever they want to talk about. The teacher modeling, but the teacher hasn't pre-selected what he or she is modeling. It's come from the learners. It's the learners' meanings that drive the lesson. And then what we have is this nice little conversation. It's been recorded. You play it back and it sounds like a real conversation. And then it's transcribed. Now, this could be done any number of ways. It could be done by the students. It could be done by students working in groups. They've got the recording on their phone, blah, blah, whatever. But it's then available for some kind of language analysis, language work, where the teacher then decides, oh, this is an interesting point. Let's have a look at that. Maybe ignoring some language features that are probably beyond the present level of the students, but focusing on things that seem to be either causing problems or worth highlighting at this stage. That's CLL. So here's an example from a group of young adults in Spain. This was collected by a colleague of mine, very small class. I think it's 3 students here. And this is the conversation that they constructed. So one of them says to Emma, what are you doing tonight? Well, where are you going tonight? She says, tonight I'm going to have supper out. A third student asks, where are you going to have supper? Now, remember, these questions have been checked with the teacher before committing. That's why it's all so accurate. The student says, Emma says, I don't know, I'm being taken out. Ooh, I'm being taken out. Now, she would never have come up with that herself. So that's something that the teacher, she said, ¿Cómo se dice? And she says to her in Spanish, and the teacher says, well, nice way of saying it, I am being taken out. Who are you going with? I'm going with a guy, but he isn't my boyfriend. Where is your boyfriend? Do you mean now? No, not now. Where will he be this evening? He's going to play water polo. Says one. Water polo, very interesting. Is your boyfriend hunky? Now, hunky like well built. Now, that's not a word that the students would probably have come up with. So that's something, again, that's introduced by the teacher. Yes, he's very hunky, and so on. So that's the conversation. It's then now I started doing this with I had a group of teenagers in Barcelona in the 1990s, possibly. And we did it as a kind of activity, not as a method, not as a method we did all the time, but we did it as a kind of activity. I'd introduce it. And we in those days we didn't have mobile phones. We had cassette recorders. Remember, we had cassette recorders with a microphone on a lead, and so they'd pass the microphone backwards and forwards to each other. And these kids created these wonderful conversations. Uh, they Certain students tended to dominate, admittedly, but then, like teenagers do, they wouldn't let other students just sit doing nothing. So they'd actually make them they'd direct a question at a student who was probably not participating very much. There was a sort of inbuilt control of the conversation and the distribution of turns. I found this really interesting, this kind of activity, and it was my first real encounter with a reactive lesson design where there was no pre-selected language of any kind, not even a topic. And it's one of the influences that started me thinking, and that finally led to Dogma. Another influence I came across much later was this person called John Wade. He was a teacher he was Australian. He was a volunteer teacher who was sent to Papua New Guinea to teach in a village for a year. And on the way to the village, he lost all his materials. There was an accident in the jungle, storm, whatever. He lost the syllabus. He lost everything. He arrived in the village, had nothing. So what he did was he just worked with the kids, the children. He took them out, wandered around the fields, counting and naming things and talking about things in the village, and built up their knowledge of English through this. That's all he had. And that led him to write a book called Teaching Without Textbooks in 1992. And this is his basic lesson design. Set up a situation where students talk about relevant topics that are important to them, exactly like CLL, but you don't tell them what the topics are, they decide. Write down what they want to say. So when they are talking about it, make a note, keep a note. Much easier online, incidentally. Use what is written to teach them about various aspects of the language. That is to say, use the material that comes up, that emerges in the lesson, as the basis of instruction. You don't go in with a pre-selected syllabus. You don't go in with a plan. You just get them going, some kind of prompt. And I'll talk about some more experiences of mine that some of you will have heard before, but it's worth repeating, I think. So that's John Wade's approach. It's totally reactive. Yeah, the teacher reacts to what the students are trying to say, takes a note, doesn't interfere. It's different from CLL in that respect. Waits till the conversation's over and then goes back. And now, of course, again, with recording devices, and also, you don't have to write down what they want to say. You can record it, or as I said, online, if you're teaching, you just keep a record that either they can all see in the chat, or you keep your own record and then you beam it up and share it with them. Task-based learning. Now, this was the one that I suppose was most influential on my thinking. The notion that you learn a language by using it, which was in theory, the communicative approach, but the communicative approach was kind of decaffeinated, if you like, very quickly. The idea that students should create their own meanings and the teachers would help them do that was abandoned in the mid 1980s. And we went back to course books which pre selected the meanings that the students were to. So now, Unit 2, we're going to do the present simple. Unit 3, we're going to do the first conditional, etc., etc., etc. The students have no say over that. So there was this kind of retrograde step in the 1980s, a reaction away from a purely communicative approach and substituted by what we call the weak communicative approach. Now, the strong communicative approach is basically task-based learning. So you give the students a task. It may be to plan an outing, to plan, I don't know, to plan an end of term party. What are we going to do? Who's going to cook what? Who's going to bring what games we're going to play, etc., etc., etc. Students prepare the task in pairs or groups. They perform the task. They get feedback on the task, which will include some kind of language focus. So, for example, oh, that was very good, but you could have said this. This might have been nice, etc. And then ideally, they repeat the task. And researchers show that the more times you repeat a task, the better you get at it, unsurprisingly. And so the cycle goes on. But that's basically the task-based cycle. Jane Willis, who's one of the great proponents of task-based learning, says the last phase in the framework, if you remember, that was the language focus, allows a closer study of some of the specific features naturally occurring in the language used during the task cycle, not features that have been pre-selected. By this point, the learners will have already worked with the language and processed it for meaning. They won't be very accurate, but that's not the point. It's their meanings. They're invested in the task. They're working collaboratively, and the teacher then tidies things up. They've processed the task for meaning. They're ready, therefore, to focus on the specific language forms that carry that meaning. So that is basically the principle underlining task-based learning. Task-based learning, task-based language teaching, has been very popular with academics, researchers, etc., less popular with teachers for all sorts of various reasons, as you could possibly imagine, and not very popular with publishers who don't know how to publish books when there's no pre-selected grammar syllabus, for example. Okay, now, don't panic. I'm going to try and explain this very simply. This is this Ken Lackman in Canada has developed this approach, which he calls the CAT framework. CAT stands for Conversation Activated Teaching. And this is on the left, you can see an elaborate description of the stages. So let me just try and summarize them for you through a diagram. Basically, what happens is that a topic is selected. Let's say it's travel. And maybe in the course book, but the course book is not open. But travel may be the theme. The students go into pairs and they talk about the topic. They have a conversation about the topic. This is to kind of get them to activate this language. Doesn't matter what they say. Then the teacher takes one of the students up to the front of the class. They sit down and the teacher has the conversation with the student about the topic travel, while the others are watching and maybe taking notes. And then the teacher, after this is over, the teacher says, okay, can you remember what my first question was? And can you remember what Pablo responded, etc.? And then bits of useful language are written onto the board. So that's the kind of cycle. Pair conversation to get it going, conversation with a teacher, out of which language emerges and is focused on. And so here is an example from one of Ken Lackman's blackboards in his classroom, and they did exactly that. The topic was travel. They're the questions he asked. And these are some of the ways that he reformulated what the students were trying to say. Now, of course, what the students do is then have a pair conversation themselves, going back, maybe change the pair where they use this language to have another conversation about travel. They repeat the task. And you see lots of similarities with task-based learning. Okay. And then finally, on my list of reactive approaches was Dogma Teaching Unplugged. But as I said, I came to Dogma Teaching Unplugged through things like CLL, community language learning, students in little circles, and through experimenting with task-based learning. And through experiments like this one, which I did. Again, I'm sorry, those of you who've seen it before, but when I started teaching in Egypt, I'd been teaching 6 months, a year, and I was very frustrated by the learners' frustration, which was palpable. So this is 1975. My whole approach had been working with a proactive approach, working with a very grammatically focused or structurally focused course book, working with beginners. A lot of the students were beginners, but they were young adults. They were very keen and very motivated, I have to say. Egypt was opening up to the Western world. They wanted to learn English for all sorts of reasons, not just for travel or chit chat, but for jobs, for careers, study, etc. But they were frustrated by the approach. It was too slow. It was too structure-based. They didn't say that, but I could sense that they were frustrated. So I went in one day and I just put this picture on the board. Now, remember, we're pre-internet, pre-anything, because we didn't have any authentic materials. There was no magazines or newspapers available in Egypt except one or two like this one, Time magazine. Put this up on the board and sat down with the students, and they were staring at me and staring at the picture and staring at each other. What's going on here? And since it was obvious that I wasn't going to do anything, they started to talk. Whoops! They started to talk about the picture, not talk about it because these were beginners, but say things. Words came up. Now, let's say there were 16 students, so there's a good chance that between them there are maybe 16 words that might be appropriate for this picture. But anyway, it started to come because they were familiar with the story behind this news item. God knows what it was, I can't remember. And they had some kind of familiarity with Saudi Arabia because they live in Egypt, might have been there. So they had things to say. So words came up, tiny combinations of words came up. And each time they came up, they looked at me and I was, don't look at me. this was. And the wonderful thing, of course, about classrooms is once the door is closed, nobody knows that you're doing this kind of experiment. I mean, I would have been sacked if anybody had known. I was just going in without a lesson plan and just saying, I didn't say anything. Anyway, so after about 5-10 minutes, I thought, well, now what do I do? So I said, well, I gave the pen to one of the students and said, Ahmed, let's say, I said to the rest of the class, help Ahmed write a summary on the board of everything you've just said. And then I went out. So again, trying to detach myself from the traditional teacher role. And I came back in 5 minutes and they still hadn't finished. And then I came back in 10 minutes and the board was full of writing. It was absolutely amazing what they'd managed to kind of retrieve. It wasn't very good as text goes, but it was their text. So then I'm faced with this dilemma. Now, what am I going to do with it? So of course, well, what would you do? I didn't correct it because it was like so far removed from anything that we might call standard English that it wasn't a case of correcting. It was taking what they were saying and putting it into my words, taking their words and putting it into my words. Yeah, this is what you're trying to say. So it's exactly the principle behind community language learning. Yeah, remember the students are sitting in groups, they say to the teacher, how do you say such and such? Teacher listen in Spanish, the teacher listens to them, says, this is how I would say it. You don't even have to be a linguist to be able to do that. You say, yeah, this is how I would say it. So I said, this is how I would say it. And I have to add here, you don't have to be a native speaker to be able to do that either. You just have to have a degree of proficiency in the language, which was like a little bit higher than where the learners are. You're the authority. And what you're saying to the learners is say, this is not how Prince Charles or King Charles would say it. This is not how Scott Thornbury would say it. This is how I would say it. Maria or Natalia or Svetlana, this is how I would say it. Because you're the teacher, you're the authority. So that dispenses with that problem. So I reformulated it onto the board. I mean, and nowadays, of course, with the internet and everything, with all the with technology, you could reformulate it onto an interactive whiteboard and make a copy that they could take home and blah blah blah, all sorts of things. But I didn't do that, obviously. But that was the lesson. That was the 45-minute lesson. I did nothing else. And what it taught me was that, first of all, minimal means maximum results. It took nothing. It took one picture to generate all that, the lesson, the content for that lesson. That was the stimulus. And the other thing, of course, it taught me was trust the students, trust the students. Just give them time. And each time you do that kind of activity, it's like CLL when you put them into groups initially, they're going, what do we talk about? Whatever. Imagine teenagers not having anything to talk about. You just think, talk about what you normally talk about, but we're going to do it in English. Um, so trust the students, trust the students. Something will come up. It may take a little bit of time initially, but they'll get used to it. At some point, I mean, you may want to tell the principles underlying this. But it's by doing lots of this kind of thing in classes, you start to get the students' trust. So, for example, on our teacher training courses here in Barcelona, one of the things we encouraged the trainee teachers to do, the trainee teachers, these are inexperienced teachers, never taught before, but so start a lesson by telling them something that happened to you, for example, or that you read or saw, something, and then have them do something similar to each other. And this was we had the students in these practice classes for research purposes. They were keeping diaries or logs of what they liked and what they didn't like about these lessons. This is what one student said. He said, "I enjoy more when a teacher sits down in front of us and explains a real thing that happened to him or her, and then he asks us for similar situations that we have gone through." You see, so it's not that the teacher is pre-teaching. I mean, it's okay, yes, they're modeling a story, let's say, and there's language there that the students could perhaps recycle, but it's basically as a stimulus. Say, this is what happened to me. Did anything happen? Has anybody had anything happen like that to you? And off you go. Oh, and here's another one. This is one of my favorite activities. I didn't invent it. A colleague of mine invented it. You go in and you say, I went to Portugal in the weekend. Let's say this is the example. But it doesn't have to be something quite as, it could be a movie you saw, or a meal you ate out with, or an expedition or a shopping expedition or whatever. It could be anything. And you tell the students that they're going to have to write an account, in this case of my trip to Portugal. They're going to have to write the story. And they go, well, how are we going to do that? And you say, well, you're going to have to ask me questions, obviously. But the questions you're going to write on these little slips of paper and you're going to do it in groups of three, maybe 3 or 4 max. So you give 12 little slips of blank paper to each group, and you say, okay, think of some questions. And when you've got a question, one of you brings it up to me, and I will write the answer on the piece of paper. But if the question is not appropriate, not relevant, or unintelligible, then I'll send it back. So they do that. They write a question. You've got questions coming from different groups. You write your answers. And then they look at the and say, okay, fine, what question should we ask now? Well, why don't we ask? Then another question comes up, more questions. It's quite hard work, I tell you what, for the teacher. But because you're getting a lot of, obviously, and then you say, okay, you've got enough answers now. In your groups, use the answers to write a summary of what I did. And this was one of the groups in this particular case. Last Friday, our English teacher, Scott, went to a conference in Lisbon. The conference was... Now, you could say, well, aren't you providing them with the language? We say, well, yes, but it's the language they asked for. They chose the questions. And I just answered the questions. But notice that as you go down, and when they're doing the writing, of course, they've got to put this information in some kind of order, and they've got to connect it, and they've got to change so the question is, what did you do at the weekend? I went to Portugal. They've got to change that to Scott and make all the other changes. And then, of course, if you go down halfway through, you see the weather was gloriously hot, and he really enjoyed his stay. The weather was gloriously hot. Now, no student in 100 years is going to say that. Where did that come from? That came from me. And in response to the question, what was the weather like? It's gloriously hot. So this is a way of feeding in language, a bit like, again, CLL, or like Ken Lackman's hat lesson. You want about travel? Remember, you can feed in lots of different useful expressions. There is the transcript of the writing. Now, the nice thing, of course, too, is that each group has written a different text. Because why? Because they asked different questions. Some of them would be, but so the texts are basically the same, but there'll be subtle differences. So there's a kind of interest in seeing. So you can put the text around the wall. Students walk around reading them all, or you can pass them from one group to another, etc., etc. And of course, then you can go back and you've got all their questions on pieces of paper. And you can take all the questions and say, now some of you are having trouble with prepositions. I got all these questions like, what did you do on the weekend? So this is where you can have the language focus, just like in task-based learning. Another one of my favorite activities. This is so easy to set up. Students in groups or pairs, maybe threes, at the beginning of the lesson. They have a piece of paper, blank piece of paper. They have a conversation. So it's exactly like you might say to our students, talk to each other about the weekend, but they don't talk, they write. It's like texting. So one says, hello, Pablo, passes the paper to Pablo, and Pablo writes, hello, Albert, passes the paper back to Albert. What did you do last weekend? And these are teenagers, teenage boys. So he says, it isn't your problem. Now, of course, because it's written, me as the teacher, I can go around and I can intervene in ways that you can't really do when students are speaking because it goes too quickly. So I can see one student's written, it isn't your problem. So I correct that to business, or I reformulate it, let's say. And then I think, hang on, there's a good expression. mind your own business. Good expression to teach teenage boys. Mind your own business. Digitally, they start talking about football, and off it goes, and it goes for pages and pages. And it's fantastic material. You can get them, you can take it in and take it home and do something with it. And or they can read it aloud. Uh, but it's their text, it's their material. It's totally reactive in the sense that all I'm doing is tidying up their meanings. Okay, and so that all led into Dogma Teaching Unplugged. I'm not going to go into the history of that of it. But I just wanted to share with you some of the influences in my own teaching and in other methods. But this was the sort of mission statement of the Dogma online discussion group, which started in the year 2000, which makes it 25 years old, actually. We are looking for ways of exploiting the learning opportunities offered by the raw material of the classroom. That is the language that emerges from the needs, interests, concerns, and desires of the people in the room. The language that emerges not from the course book, not from the syllabus, not what's going to be in the exam, but the language that emerges from the needs, interests, concerns, and desires of the people in the room. That was what seemed to be radical, but what I'm saying is it wasn't that radical. It was part of a long tradition in language teaching. And then Luke Meddings and I in 2009 produced a book of teaching practice ideas, activities, not a course book, activities. And we gave advice as to how you could deal with the language that emerges. So nothing sensational about this. It's just taking notes, basically, and good board work, just as in Ken Lackman's approach, organizing the board preferably into different categories, expressions, grammar, vocabulary, whatever. And these are some of the activities in that book. And this one is about when things that you say. So you say something as a teacher in the class, and you think, oh, that's a good expression. So you might have, see, under set it up, you might have said something like, okay, hold on, this isn't going to work. And then you think, that's a good expression. And you say, what did I just say? Can you remember? And so on. And then a lot of the language that's learned in the classroom is incidental. But unless we capture it, it might always be incidental for most students. So we want to pin it down. Here is another activity. And in this case, it's helping the learners with their output. Through reformulation, basically, just as I did with the Time magazine. I'm not going to dwell on that. We're running out of time. But in the book, we make some suggestions as to how you could deal with emergent language, the language that comes up. A very important thing is to show that you value it, that you want them to contribute to the lesson, reward what they say. Oh, that's a good point, Maria. Thank you for making that. Yeah. And then capture it, retrieve it, because a lot of stuff gets said in classrooms and it's just noise. But you want to, that's a good expression. Let's have a look at that. Have the students, well, you repeat it and have the students repeat it. That draws it to their attention. It raises it above the level of the normal classroom noise. Reformulate it, tidy it up. And if the students have been working in groups, have them report what they've said in the group work. This is a really important stage. You put students into groups, put them into groups to talk about their weekend, but then that's it. No, tell us what came up, who said what was interesting, what was the same. And then it carries on. Recycle it, very important. So we take a piece of language that's come up and say, how can we use this? Let's try this in a different context. A written record of it. Maybe have the students research it. So something comes up, like somebody says something like, I am studying for my exams all month. And you reformulate that as I've been studying for my exams all month. And you say, okay, what is that? What is that? I've been studying. Okay, look it up. Look it up in your course book. Go to the grammar section of your course book. Find out what it is. Find out where it appears in the book. And reference it. Link it to the syllabus. If you have a syllabus, say, okay, we just did we just did the present perfect continuous. Where does it come in the course book? Find it. And of course, review it review it in the lesson and review it at the beginning of the next lesson, the vocabulary particularly. Okay, I think we're going to move on very quickly because we're running out of time. We won't do that. We won't do that, unfortunately. This is for how you do this online if you're teaching online. And it comes from a website written by a teacher during the pandemic. How to record and retrieve emergent language. And he uses a Google Doc, which is shared with the students. Everything that comes out goes into the document, so the students get a copy. And then this language, stuff that can come up, particularly vocabulary, can be transferred onto, for example, Quizlet. I'm sure you know Quizlet. They can use a kind of digital flashcards that they can use individually for practice, retrieval, and memorization. They test themselves, and you can incorporate the Quizlet into your synchronous online lessons if that's what you're doing. Okay, just quickly, just to finish, the advantages of a proactive approach, so the traditional approach, if you like, there are advantages, and one of them is that the teacher controls the agenda. This is very important for many teaching situations, large classes, inexperienced teachers. There's an exam that has to be prepared for. I mean, you want to control the agenda, or your institution wants you to control the agenda, or the parents want you to control the agenda. And you can align your lessons with the syllabus, with the exams, the curriculum, etc. So present perfect continuous is in the syllabus, so I'll create a lesson teaching the present perfect continuous, whether the students need it or not. The way that learners respond to the material is more or less predictable, which is great for new teachers. And it focuses attention primarily on getting it right, on accuracy, which is many students, parents, school directors, etc., expectation of what language learning is all about, getting it right. The advantages, on the other hand, of a reactive approach are that it gives a certain amount of agency to the learners, responsibility to the learners. The learners are responsible, partly responsible, for the content of the lesson. And there's so many different ways of doing this. And I've just shared some with you. But another one I didn't mention is the one that my colleague Neil Forrest, who I did a lot of teacher training with here in Barcelona, starts every lesson where the students go into groups straight away and they talk about something that they've done or seen or read or heard since the last lesson. They just share. Now, they do that every lesson, so they kind of come mentally prepared. Out of these conversations, so Neil is walking around, correcting, providing vocabulary, etc. There's going to be a story or two worth repeating. So he'll say to one of the students, okay, Maria, tell the rest of the class what that strange thing that happened to you on the bus on the way to work, and so on. And then we have a lesson developing out of that. the focus is on form, but less importantly, it's more important the focus is on meaning, and it addresses students' communicative needs in a way that the course book doesn't necessarily do. And very importantly, it adapts to learners' developmental stage. So, why are we teaching the present perfect continuous? Oh, it's in the syllabus. Are the students ready for it? They need it? I mean, this is just an assumption. Pre-selected language items have been chosen by somebody who lives 10,000 miles away from the classroom. Somebody in Oxford said, "Oh, I think it's good for students at B1 to learn the present perfect continuous." Why? Why? Has anybody ever asked you, please teach me the present perfect continuous? No, never. What they do want, though, is language that is matches their developmental stage, stuff that they could maybe just a tiny bit beyond their developmental stage. Yeah, so there's that the syllabus is in sync. It synchronizes with the stage they're at. We all know that there's diversity in classrooms. Some students we call weak, some students we call strong. There's always going to be that kind of diversity. But if learners are allowed to say what they want to say and then you tidy it up, some will say stuff that's not very sophisticated, but that's okay. That's where they're at. Yeah. So a emergent syllabus is one that can accommodate a greater range of abilities in the classroom, theoretically. And that relates to one of your questions at the beginning. How do we deal with the diversity in the classroom? Teaching the present perfect continuous doesn't deal with the diversity in the classroom. There'll be some students who already know it. There'll be some students who won't get it. And there'll be a few students who are at the right stage to make the most of it. But there'll be about 3 or 4 in the middle out of 15 or 20. So teaching tiny little bits of grammar like the present perfect continuous does not cater for diversity. But if you go into a class and say, okay, tell me about something interesting, recent activities, or tell each other, blah, 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 off they go, blah, 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 blah. Now, at some point, one of those students will need the present perfect continuous because they're trying to say something like what they've been doing lately. And then you can drop it in. If the others want to use it, they can. If they don't, they don't. But it's not the whole lesson is not about the present perfect continuous. That's about diversity, how to cope with diversity. Oh, there's that. Yeah, it accommodates diversity in the classroom. And I would like to think that the content that the learners generate is more engaging and memorable than the content in any course book. Okay. We're out of time. I'm just going to stop this and I'm just going to go back to those questions at the beginning and pick one or two. So, I mean, Olena asked how to make an engaging lesson with minimal resources. Well, I said the Time magazine one would be an example. You don't have to be that extreme, that minimalist. But if a student comes in to a lesson and their leg or their arm, let's say, is in plaster, you have an option. Ignore it, and that might be the right option. Sometimes we don't want to bring, and this is I don't have to tell you guys this, but sometimes we don't want to bring the outside world into the classroom. We want the classroom to be a buffer zone. We don't talk about shit that happens. But at other times it would be bizarre to ignore the fact that the student has come in with an arm and plaster. And this is where you then say, okay, stop the lesson, put the lesson plan aside. Let's talk to Yevgeny about whatever it is that happened to him. Now, that's your decision, but it is an option. Yeah, remote teaching. I mean, there's a whole talk, Hannah, about teaching remotely using these kind of approaches. And I've suggested in passing how, but I mean, remote teaching actually lends itself to a lot of these techniques. I mean, one of the things, keeping a record of as you go along in the chat as to what people are trying to say, then they can, they've got it there. They go back to it's so much easier than just using the board in the classroom. Breakout rooms, of course, and then reporting back after the group work is very important. So a lot of these basic things, and also, what the students have in their own, if they're in their own house, what they have that they can share, which they can't bring necessarily to the classroom. Yeah, so you go and you say, go and find something that somebody gave you that you really value, and then come and tell us about it. Like, find someone who that's pure dogma in a sense, using what's in the room, but the room is their room, not the classroom. Yes, this is a good. Svetlana says, does the method focus rather on speaking skills at the expense of? There's a danger, yes, that you will neglect the other skills. Speaking and listening, you do a lot of listening to you, listening to each other. Speaking, yes. I mean, on the whole, what learners most want and need is practice in speaking. They don't get it outside the classroom. So reading and writing, or reading particularly, and listening, they can do. There's a lot of resources now online, streaming videos and with subtitles. It's less, I think, urgent than speaking. There's not many. Okay, artificial intelligence, yeah, speaking to a bot, but really seriously, who wants to do that? A lot. Um, so I do think, yes, there is. Now, if the learners are learning English not because they want to speak, but because they want to study at a university or pass, some kind of written exam, then of course you need to adapt, yeah, and include more writing. But that's also possible using a sort of a more, we're using a learner-driven approach, working from the student's writing. And Violetta says, do you think we can structure our lessons only using dogma? Well, no. I mean, not necessarily. In fact, I'll just go back and share this again. There was a lovely thing that somebody did on a website, on their blog, if I can go back. Where is it? Oh, yeah. Oops. No, I'm going to go backwards. They created this thing called the dogmometer. There it is. And so you rate yourself where you are on the dogmometer. Are you like hardcore dogma? Or are you at least, you're the teacher who lets the students derail a lesson? Or are you only at the level of trying out activities from teaching Unplugged? Or just maximizing speaking opportunities? Or maybe you're at the level of asking students real questions rather than display questions. But so, in other words, there's a whole range of degrees of possibility in terms of a reactive approach. And it may not be possible in your classrooms, or it may not be possible for you as a teacher, so it goes against your style. But you have those two options at least. You have the proactive, fine. You've got a course book, you've got a syllabus, you've got exams, you've got an institution, you've got a headmaster. Yes, I have to teach the present perfect continuous on Tuesday. It's in the syllabus. But you also have the opportunity to use your adaptive expertise. Remember adaptive expertise, like the nurses who stop the lesson at any point and say, wow, that's interesting. Tell us more about that, Yevgeny. Yeah, and a balance between the two approaches. So it doesn't have to be the design of a whole course. No, I'm just looking at more questions here. Debbie had to go. Yeah, I mean, uh, there's a yeah. Well, no, Beverly asked, how do you reconcile dogma with teaching with the ideology of needs analysis and diagnostic testing? I mean, I think again, needs analysis. Needs analysis is what task-based learning promotes the idea of needs analysis. What tasks are you going to choose? Well, if it's not in a course book, how are you going to decide what time? Well, then you ask the students what it is that you have to do with English, and that's what the needs analysis is. So the task-based learning is particularly good for people who have very specific needs. If your learners don't have any specific needs, and that's 99% of students under the age of 15 who are studying English don't have any specific needs, then you may go for their interests and find out as much as possible you can about their interests or their out of class activities or how they use the internet, etc., and maybe adapt your teaching a little bit in that direction. And I'm sure you do that. I'm not telling you anything that you don't know. Right. Well, sorry, it wasn't very interactive, but I hope that your expectations were met to a certain extent, that you know a little bit more about dogma, and you realize that it's actually on a spectrum of activities, of teaching styles that go from the very controlled and teacher-centered to the very free and learner-centered. And you just have to find the place that suits you and your institution and your students' parents. You have responsibilities to all of them. So don't do it just because Scott Thornbury said you should. No, do it because it feels right. Okay, folks, I'll let you go. It's late. I'm sure you've got better things to do than listen to me waffle on. It's wonderful to be with you. I can tell you that. And it makes me feel back in touch with the teaching population of Ukraine, which is one, from my experience, is one of the most sophisticated and interesting in anywhere. So the very fact that 100 of you came out this evening is testimony that you are so committed, dedicated, in situation which is less than ideal. So on that note, God bless you all.